Super's really in the news at the moment. There has been some big changes, or more accurately, a very small change that has generated a big debate. So what are the changes? So you put money in your superannuation account and you get a lower rate of tax. And that lower rate of tax is what we call a super tax concession. These superannuation tax concessions are actually getting really big. Tax concession just on the earnings in a fund is about $23 billion a year. Why is this important? Well, the government's basically worked out that there are a small number of people with really big balances who are earning enormous returns and getting really large superannuation tax concessions. So the government's tried to cut down on the very worst of this. When you put money into your super fund and when you earn interest on that money in the super fund, you get taxed at a concessional rate. So both of those activities have superannuation tax concessions. The government's focusing only on one half of that, the earnings on the fund. So if you imagine a super fund is basically full of these assets that are making some kind of return, whether it's shares, whether it's a business, whether it's money in the bank and it's just earning interest. There's lots of different ways super funds get earnings in their super accounts. The changes the government is making is just on the earnings side. So we're just talking today about the earnings in a super fund, not the contributions into the super fund. So contributions is when you earn your salary and your boss basically takes out about 10.5% and puts it in your super fund. Well, we're not looking at those tax concessions today. We're just looking at the tax concessions on super earnings. All right, so why do we have superannuation tax concessions is the first question. Well, why super exists is actually a little vague, and part of the government reform is actually to come up with a definition for why it exists. But really, most people think that superannuation tax concessions are there and designed to encourage you to save more for your retirement, because the more you save for your retirement, the bigger the asset pool, the less reliant you will be on the age pension, and hence the government's budget, into the future. So what are the changes the government's making? Well, it's not making a change to all super accounts. It's only making a change to the top 0.5% of super accounts. And that is super accounts with a balance of more than $3 million. So how big is a $3 million super balance? Well, let's look at the median balance at retirement. So the median balance for Australians who are about to retire, so Australians aged 60 to 64, the median balance after they've had all of their working lives to accumulate is about $160,000. That means that half of all Australians who are about to retire have less than $160,000, and half of all Australians who are about to retire have more than $160,000. So the difference between about $160,000 and $3 million is about 20 times. So what are the changes? All the earnings on the assets above $3 million will be taxed at 30 cents rather than the current 15 cents. Now, this is still a tax concession. If they were outside of super, they'd be paying more like 47 cents in the dollar. So instead of 47 cents, they're paying 30 cents. Now, it's only the earnings on the assets over $3 million. So if you had a super fund worth $3,001,001, you'd still get the 15-cent concessional rate for the first $3 million. It would only be 30 cents on the earnings from that dollar above $3 million. So really, people with balances close to $3 million won't have almost any difference in their tax. It's not until their balances get well above $3 million that they'll actually notice any difference. So super tax concessions on earnings are big, $23 billion a year big, and they mainly go to high income earners. As this graph shows, 40% of superannuation tax concessions on earnings go to the top 10%, the highest decile. And if we look at the top 20%, so the 9th decile and the highest decile, it's about just over 50%. More than half of superannuation tax concessions go to the top 20% of income earners. Why is the top 20% important? Well, if we look at people in retirement, about 80% of people have a pension, an age pension or an age part pension. That means that top 20%, the part that's getting over half of all the superannuation tax concessions, are not reliant on the age pension at all. So if the point of superannuation tax concessions is to reduce pressure on the age pension, then effectively half of them, or over half of them, are not doing that because they're going out to people who would never be on the age pension. So the government is tipping in to the super balances of those that really don't need it. So superannuation tax concessions are incredibly unfair. The government's changes are only going to affect a tiny minority of people, those with $3 million or more, and the average or the median balance at retirement is only $160,000. So this isn't going to affect almost anybody, but the people it does affect are getting enormous tax concessions which they don't need, and the government's going to claw back some of that tax. So it's not a big change, and it's not going to affect anybody who certainly can't afford it. There's no such thing as self-funded retirees. There are just retirees who get some of their funding from the age pension, and there are retirees that get it through the tax system through tax concessions.